The archives had no clocks, only the slow shift of light through high, dust-blurred windows. Elias Varner liked it that way. The world outside was loud, rushed, always asking for proof before patience had done its work. Here, in the back room where forgotten shelves bowed under the weight of centuries, he could listen to history breathe. It was in this dim sanctuary on a late afternoon in early autumn that his gloved fingers brushed something that shouldn't have been there. Between two bound ledgers of shipping manifests from the 1880s lay a thin linen wrap, the fibers brittle yet surprisingly intact. Elias pulled it free, his breath catching, as a small roll of ancient papyrus slid onto the desk. The edges were darkened by time, but the center was impossibly well preserved, as if it had been shielded from the world. He unrolled it just enough to see the ink. Faded brown strokes, unmistakably hieroglyphic, but in an arrangement he didn't recognize. It wasn't a prayer or a tally of goods. The lines curled and bent into deliberate patterns, almost symmetrical, almost musical. His training told him to catalogue it, send it to the Egyptology department for classification, and move on. But something in those markings whispered otherwise. He leaned closer, eyes tracing a peculiar repetition. A falcon's head beside an unfamiliar spiral, repeating every third line. It wasn't part of any known Egyptian ceremonial text he'd seen. Elias had read thousands of inscriptions, studied the syntax of dynasties, but this was language hiding in plain sight. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Still chasing ghosts, Varner?" Professor Haldane leaned on the doorway, his smirk carved as deep as the wrinkles around his eyes. "If no one's cracked it in 100 years, it's probably just decorative." Elias didn't look up. "Or it's waiting for the right eyes," he murmured. "More to the scroll than to the man." Haldane chuckled and left, his footsteps echoing into the main hall. Silence returned, thick and charged. Elias's mind began pulling threads from memory, a carved panel he'd seen in Luxor years ago, the strange symbol etched in a trader's necklace from a Cairo bazaar, a footnote in an obscure 1911 excavation report. They shared fragments of this same pattern. The thought sent a shiver through him. By the time the bell tower outside struck 6, Elias had decided this was no ornamentation. It was a code, and codes were meant to be broken. He packed the scroll into a protective case, signing it out under his name alone. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of standing on the edge of something rare. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Professor Haldane's life. Then at night, under the dim glow of his desk lamp at home, Elias spread out the papyrus again. Outside, the city hummed without him. Inside, time stretched thin as he began to sketch each glyph into his notebook, marking patterns, counting intervals, isolating anomalies. Every repetition confirmed it. This was a message meant to be locked away, its meaning hidden from all but the most persistent. And somewhere, deep in his gut, Elias knew that once he deciphered it, nothing in his life or in the history books would ever be the same. By morning, Elias's apartment looked less like a home and more like a war room. Pages of sketches, transliterations, and comparative hieroglyphic charts carpeted his desk. Coffee sat cold beside him, untouched since dawn. His eyes burned, but his mind refused to rest, not when the scroll's strange symmetry kept unfolding into new possibilities. He had taken the precaution of scanning the papyrus at the highest resolution allowed by the archive's preservation policy. Every blemish, every hairline crack was captured, and yet it was the shapes, between the glyphs that drew his attention now, the negative space. Ancient scribes were deliberate. Nothing was accidental. A falcon head aligned with a spiral wasn't just art, it was intention. By mid-afternoon, he'd matched the sequence to 3 separate sources: a fragmentary wall inscription from the reign of Pharaoh Seti II, a funerary amulet found near the Valley of the Queens, and, most oddly, a set of pottery shards from a site hundreds of miles south. These were never meant to be connected unless someone had wanted to hide something across centuries and landscapes. That was when the whispers began. It started with an overheard conversation in the staff lounge, 2 junior researchers murmuring about the cursed tomb, laughing nervously. By evening, an anonymous email arrived in Elias's inbox. Leave the scroll alone. Some things are better left buried. There was no sender name, no reply address. Elias read it twice before setting it aside. Fear was an old trick in academic circles, used to steer curiosity away from dangerous or politically sensitive topics, but this felt heavier, older, as if the warning came from more than just human ambition. That night he dreamed of sandstorms swallowing entire cities, of stone doors sealing shut against the sun, of voices speaking in a tongue he somehow understood but could never repeat aloud. When he awoke, sweat-soaked and breathless, he went straight to his notes. Somewhere in the glyph sequences, a subtle shift had eluded him, a set of symbols that broke the pattern only once. The disruption spelled out something he could translate. The keeper sleeps where the moon swallows the sun. He froze, pen hovering above the page. An eclipse, a location tied to a rare astronomical event. If he could cross-reference it with ancient Egyptian eclipse records, he might have a time and place. But there was another problem. The phrase "the keeper" was no ordinary title. In Egyptian myth, keepers guarded sacred or dangerous relics, often sworn to protect them even beyond death. And where the moon swallows the sun suggested a site deliberately aligned with cosmic cycles, a site that, according to myth, should never be opened. He sat back, rubbing his temples. The academic in him knew this could be a career-making discovery. The man in him felt the pull of something more primal. A story unfinished, a challenge unaccepted. The phone rang. It was Haldane. "You're still at it, aren't you?" The professor's tone was more irritated than amused now. "Listen to me, Varna. Some tombs are sealed for a reason. You're poking at something better left to dust." Elias didn't answer right away. He let the silence carry his defiance. Finally, he said, "If history wanted it forgotten, it shouldn't have left me the map." Haldane sighed, muttered something inaudible, and hung up. Elias turned back to the scroll, tracing the falcon and spiral again with his eyes. It no longer felt like ink on papyrus. It felt like a door. And every part of him was preparing to open it. The days that followed were a strange blend of exhilaration and unease. Elias moved through the archives like a shadow, his conversations clipped, his eyes always scanning for who might be watching him. He could feel it. The scroll had made him a marked man, not by the faculty whose petty jealousies he'd learned to sidestep, but by something older, more patient. He began pulling obscure excavation reports from the restricted stacks, pretending they were part of his cataloguing work. Late at night, in the silence of the archival reading room, he pieced together a constellation of clues: an unreported chamber under the Temple of Horus, a broken stele recovered from a Nubian burial site, and the oral history of a remote desert tribe that spoke of the sleeping mouth of the gods. The warnings persisted. A note slipped under his apartment door. "Do not seek the tomb. It does not welcome you." The handwriting was jagged, desperate. Elias held it for a long time, wondering if fear had finally reached him. But instead he felt his resolve harden. Every threat only confirmed that the tomb existed, and that someone had worked very hard to keep it hidden. One evening, in the dim back corridor near the climate-controlled vault, he overheard two senior curators whispering. Their words floated to him between the hum of the air system. "Varna's digging where he shouldn't." They always think they're the first. They never are. And when they find it, a pause, then almost in a hiss, it ends them. Elias stepped back into the shadows, his pulse loud in his ears. He knew now that this wasn't just academic territory. This was a place where history, myth, and mortality blurred. That night, at his desk, he returned to the translation. The falcon and spiral sequence that had first drawn him in revealed more when aligned with lunar eclipse records from 1200 to 800 BCE. Only one site matched both the celestial data and the coordinates implied by the code, a barren stretch of desert west of Aswan, marked on no official excavation maps. But alongside the coordinates, a second line emerged in his translation. "The guardian's breath will outlast the thief's bones." He sat back, eyes fixed on the words. In the mythology of the New Kingdom, the guardian's breath often symbolized traps, lethal ones, placed in tombs to ward off intruders. Poison gases, collapsing chambers, pits disguised beneath painted floors. The ancients had perfected death as a deterrent. The next morning, over bitter coffee in the archives break room, Haldane cornered him again. "You're playing with fire, Varna," he said, voice low. "You think you've found something new, but the last man who went after that tomb, they found his camp abandoned, his notes burned. And him?" The professor shook his head. "Never found a trace." Elias met his gaze. "Then I'll be the first." Haldane studied him for a long moment, then left without another word. As the door swung shut behind the older man, Elias realized the whispers, the threats, the warnings. They no longer frightened him. They fueled him. Somewhere in the sands of Egypt, the forbidden tomb waited, and he was already on his way to it. The flight to Cairo was uneventful, but the weight in Elias's chest grew heavier with each passing hour. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the hum of a storm just beyond the horizon. He told no one his true purpose, not even the friend in the Department of Antiquities who stamped his research clearance without asking too many questions. In the bustling chaos of Khan el-Khalili market, Elias bought supplies under the guise of an architectural surveyor: canvas tents, water purification tablets, a handheld GPS, and rolls of linen for specimen wrapping. The shopkeepers chatted warmly, unaware that he intended to walk into a place their ancestors might have warned against. That night, he spread his notes across the desk in his small hotel room. The map he had drawn from the scroll's code lay in the center. Surrounding it were photographs of the falcon and spiral glyphs from artifacts scattered in museums around the world. When arranged just so, they formed a pattern pointing to a singular valley, a place absent from any official registry, yet eerily consistent in oral traditions as the valley where the sun dies. Morning found him on a rattling jeep headed south along the Nile. The driver, a wiry man named Kamal, had been recommended by his friend in the ministry. Kamal said little, but when Elias unfolded the map, his eyes flickered with something between curiosity and alarm. "You go there?" Kamal said slowly. "You must be ready not to come back." "I'm ready," Elias replied, though the dryness in his mouth suggested otherwise. 2 days later, After endless stretches of sand and silence, they reached the point where the road thinned into nothing. The horizon shimmered in the heat, and the only sound was the soft hiss of wind over stone. Elias consulted his GPS, but the coordinates matched. The valley entrance was narrow, framed by jagged cliffs. Faint carvings marked the rock face, worn nearly smooth by time. He brushed away the dust and saw them, the falcon and spiral, carved larger here than anywhere he'd seen before. They camped nearby, waiting for the light to shift. According to the code, the final marker would reveal itself only at sunset, when shadows aligned in a particular way. Elias passed the hours pacing, jotting quick notes and studying the cliff walls. Kamal stayed close to the jeep, muttering prayers under his breath. As the sun dipped low, the shadows deepened, and then Elias saw it, a narrow fissure in the rock, previously invisible, now outlined perfectly by the meeting of light and darkness. Heart-pounding, he approached. The air that flowed from the opening was cool, impossibly so given the desert heat, and it carried with it the faint scent of something long sealed away. Dust, stone, and the whisper of age-old secrets. He turned to Kamal. "Tomorrow we go in." Kamal shook his head. "I will wait outside. Some doors are not meant for all men to open." Elias didn't argue. He had expected to go in alone, and somehow that felt exactly right. As night fell over the valley, the fissure in the cliff seemed to watch him, a slit pupil in the eye of a sleeping giant. He lay awake in his tent, listening to the wind, certain that whatever waited inside had already felt his presence. At dawn, the desert was unnervingly still. No wind, no shifting sand, just an oppressive silence pressing in on the valley. Elias stood at the mouth of the fissure, his lamp in one hand and a wrapped bundle of tools in the other. The narrow gap forced him to turn sideways, stones scraping his shoulders as he slipped into the cool darkness. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, the kind of stillness that had not been disturbed in millennia. His lamplight danced over walls smoothed by ancient chisels, revealing lines of hieroglyphs that spiraled inward like a coiled serpent. The falcon symbol appeared again and again, but here it was different, its wings outstretched as if shielding something behind it. 100 feet in, the passage widened into a small antechamber. Elias paused to examine the carvings more closely. The script was more elaborate now, curling into poetic warnings. "Turn away, for the breath of the keeper waits in shadow." Another line read, "The one who takes will carry nothing out but his bones." Elias knew the stories, tomb curses often embellished to deter grave robbers, but there was something unsettling in the precision of these warnings. They were not grandiose threats, they were instructions. He set up a small camera to document everything, careful not to disturb the dust more than necessary. As he translated sections aloud, the sound of his voice in the enclosed space unnerved him. Each word seemed to linger longer than it should, as if the stone itself were listening. Deeper in, the corridor sloped gently downward. The temperature dropped further, and a faint mineral tang filled the air. "The breath of the keeper," Elias thought grimly. He slipped on a respirator mask, remembering accounts of tombs sealed with decomposing organics or natural gases, lethal to the unprepared. At the bottom of the slope, he reached a sealed doorway carved from a single slab of black basalt. It was flawless, save for the central motif, the falcon and spiral carved in relief so deep he could feel the grooves with his fingertips. Elias ran his hands along the edges, searching for the mechanism described in a marginal note from the old excavation report he'd found weeks earlier. At last, His fingers brushed a shallow depression just above the falcon's head. Pressing it caused a faint vibration through the stone, followed by a slow grinding noise. The slab shifted inward with agonizing slowness, releasing a breath of air so cold it fogged his lamp glass. For a heartbeat, Elias hesitated. He thought of the warnings, the notes slipped under his door, the curator's hushed conversations. Then he stepped inside. The chamber beyond was small and stark. No treasure glittered in the lamplight, no golden sarcophagi, no jeweled relics. Only a single stone plinth in the center, and upon it a carved box of alabaster sealed with what appeared to be resin. Hieroglyphs covered the plinth. Elias translated them silently, his pulse quickening. Within lies the voice of the king who chose silence. Disturb him, and his silence will be yours. He reached out, then drew his hand back. Not yet. This was no moment to rush. Somewhere above, beyond layers of stone and sand, the desert sun climbed higher, unaware that in its shadow a man stood on the edge of history. And perhaps the edge of his own fate. Elias forced himself to breathe slowly, the respirator mask hissing softly with each inhale. His hand hovered above the alabaster box, the lamplight tracing its smooth, almost luminescent surface. The resin seal had darkened with age, spiderweb cracks hinting at its fragility, yet something about it felt deliberate. This wasn't a seal meant to keep the world out. It was meant to keep what was inside in. He circled the plinth, reading the hieroglyphs again from every angle. The phrasing was peculiar, not the formal tone used in royal tombs, but something almost personal, as if written by the occupant himself. I chose silence so the world might forget my name. Break my silence, and the sand will cover you as it did me. Elias set down his pack, unrolled his tools, and selected a thin chisel. Each tap against the brittle resin sent a sharp crack, echoing through the chamber. The sound seemed too loud, as though the stone walls were leaning in to listen. When the seal finally gave way, a faint puff of dry, cold air brushed his face. Inside, wrapped in disintegrating linen, was not a body, but a collection of small clay tablets, each etched with the same falcon and spiral symbol. His heart leapt. These could be records, perhaps a lost chronicle or a royal confession. But then he saw it, carved into the inner lid of the box. A map. Not to a city, not to a treasure, but to another tomb. This one marked with a different symbol entirely, an eclipse, the moon devouring the sun. The same phrase from the scroll's translation flashed in his mind. The keeper sleeps where the moon swallows the sun. The realization hit hard. This chamber wasn't the destination. It was a waypoint, a decoy to keep seekers from the true forbidden tomb. Elias photographed every tablet, careful not to damage the linen further, but as he worked, a strange pressure began to build in his ears. Like the air before a thunderstorm, his lamp flickered. A fine stream of sand drifted from a crack above the plinth. Instinct screamed at him to leave. He packed his tools and photographs with rapid precision, his gloves trembling only slightly. The grinding sound he'd heard when opening the basalt door returned, now louder, closer, as if the stone itself were reclaiming its secret. By the time Elias squeezed back into the narrow entrance corridor, the antechamber behind him was already choking with falling dust. He emerged into the blinding sunlight, coughing into his mask, and saw Kamal watching him with unreadable eyes. "You went in alone," Kamal said flatly. "I found something," Elias replied, his voice ragged. "But it's only the beginning." Kamal's gaze shifted to the fissure in the cliff, where fresh cracks marred the stone. "Then you've woken it." That night, as Elias pored over the photographs by the campfire, the eclipse symbol stared back at him, patient and unblinking. Somewhere beyond this valley, deeper in the desert, the true forbidden tomb awaited, and now he knew exactly where to look. They broke camp before sunrise, the horizon a thin line of silver against the dark. The desert air was cold, biting through Elias's jacket as Kamal drove them east, away from the cliffs and deeper into the uncharted dunes. Elias kept the map from the alabaster box open on his lap, tracing the path with a gloved finger. The route was treacherous. No landmarks, no road, only the shifting dunes and the pale light of dawn. Every hour, Elias glanced at the sky, calculating the position of the sun. The map's markings aligned with an eclipse event, but the terrain itself hinted at something else, natural stone ridges forming the shape of a crescent. By midday, they reached a stretch of desert unlike anything Elias had seen. The sand here was darker, almost black, streaked with fragments of obsidian that glittered in the light. At the center of this strange basin stood a massive stone monolith, weathered yet impossibly upright, its surface etched with the eclipse symbol. Kamal refused to step closer. "This is where the stories come from," he said quietly. "Men who enter here do not return." Elias approached alone. The base of the monolith revealed a hidden stairway, half buried in centuries of drifted sand. He cleared it with his hands, each movement sending a small cascade down the steps. The entrance gaped like a wound in the earth, the air seeping from it unnervingly cold. Descending, he found himself in a long, straight corridor. This was no cramped fissure like the first tomb. It was deliberate, monumental. The walls were polished limestone, reflecting the dim light from his lamp in ghostly ripples. Hieroglyphs lined the passage, but here the tone was different. Reverent, almost fearful. One line stopped him cold. The keeper's silence guards the sin of the pharaoh who should never be named. The corridor ended in a vast chamber, the ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center stood a black granite sarcophagus, its lid carved with both the falcon and spiral and the eclipse symbol intertwined. Around it, 6 statues of jackal-headed Anubis faced inward, their eyes inlaid with shards of obsidian that seemed to absorb the lamplight. Elias approached slowly. There was no treasure, no clutter, only the sarcophagus and the oppressive weight of the air. He ran his hand over the carvings, tracing the eclipse symbol. Then he noticed the cracks in the floor, thin lines radiating outward from the sarcophagus like the spokes of a wheel. His training screamed that this was a trigger mechanism, perhaps for a trap, perhaps for something worse. He hesitated, torn between the historian's hunger for truth and the creeping certainty that opening this sarcophagus would cross a line even he couldn't uncross. A whisper seemed to rise from the cold air around him, not in words, but in a sensation, a warning, ancient and absolute. Elias stepped back. For the first time since finding the scroll, he considered leaving without opening what lay before him. But the story, he knew, was not finished. Elias stood there for what felt like hours, the beam of his lamp trembling slightly in his hand. The sarcophagus loomed, the granite lid slick beneath the faint sheen of moisture in the air. The statues of Anubis seemed to watch him, their obsidian eyes absorbing every flicker of his indecision. He thought of the alabaster box, the falcon and spiral code, the warnings carved in stone. He thought of Haldane's voice, mocking yet laced with a strange undercurrent of fear. They never are the first. And beneath it all, he felt the steady pulse of the truth. Whatever was inside this sarcophagus was not meant for possession, but for remembrance. Elias circled it slowly, running his hand along the inscriptions. These were not funerary prayers or the usual boastful proclamations of a pharaoh's reign. Instead, they told a story in fragmented lines, a ruler whose ambition had brought famine, who had ordered the destruction of temples, who had executed priests who defied him. The final verses spoke of a coalition of scribes, masons, and guardians who chose to erase his name from history, sealing him here so that his corruption would never inspire again. He realized then that this was no tomb of glory, it was a prison, and the silence surrounding it was the sentence. Elias set down his tools. The hunger to open it had burned hot for weeks, but now he felt a different fire, the weight of responsibility. If he opened it, he would break the pact made by those who had risked everything to lock this darkness away. Instead, he knelt and photographed every inch of the inscriptions, documenting the story without violating the seal. When he finished, he placed his hand on the granite and whispered, "You will stay here. The world doesn't need you." The journey back to the surface felt lighter, though the cold air clung to his skin until he emerged into the blinding daylight. Kamal was waiting at the top of the stairs, silent, but the brief nod he gave carried something like respect. Weeks later, back at the archive, Elias published nothing. His notes were locked away under his own seal, accessible only to those he trusted. The photographs he kept hidden, labeled simply "Silence of the Keeper." Haldane passed him in the corridor one afternoon, eyes flicking briefly toward him. "So, did you find it?" Elias smiled faintly. "I found what I needed to." It was months before he returned to the valley in thought, standing again in memory before the granite lid. And in those moments he understood the true treasure he had brought back, the choice not to take. Some stories, he realized, were meant to remain unfinished. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.